the conference is already over, I thought I'd just bid you all adieu and go home. So, no, but seriously, when was it, Chris, that I met you? November? November, I met Chris here at the NCTC at another meeting on the landscape conservation cooperatives being led through Dan Ash and the Fish and Wildlife Service. And I met Joe Burns from U.S. Department of Agriculture. And as Chris put it, I wasn't going to put it this way. They begged and pleaded me to be part of this because they needed some idiot to talk about climate change at the conference. And they certainly got an idiot. But I have to say that when they came back to me with the title of Green Infrastructure and Climate Change, my first reaction to Joe was, green infrastructure, that's really not my forte. And Joe said, well, we'll help you through it because it really is, you just don't know it. And as a segue to that for a second, bear with me, I give a lot of presentations every year on climate change and from the policy and the science perspective, from Interior's perspective, as well as the White House's perspective on various issues related to climate change, especially for the Arctic. And I have to say that every time I give a talk and put a talk together, I get some nugget of revelation and education out of it. And it's one of the best parts of my job. The other part is meeting folks like you and finding out what you actually do to implement various things that we just look at as policy back in Washington. But in putting this talk together, I was really worried about the green infrastructure part. And as I went through the presentation, and I'm segueing now over to what you'll see in the slides, I wanted to focus first on getting everybody to a baseline of what is climate change, what do we know, and where is it headed? And this will be based on a lot of good scientists from across the world as part of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, but also the U.S. Global Change Research Program's ongoing national climate assessment. So this is not my take on climate change. This is the consensus of the scientific community on what is happening with climate change. And it's a very, very conservative approach. I want you to keep that in mind when you start seeing some of the results of what we're already observing, but where we're going with climate change. The second part is that I can talk until I'm blue in the face about mean annual temperature variation or heat index as an annual norm across the country. But what you really want to know is, so what does this mean in my backyard? We'll talk about that because climate change science is just one piece of the equation. What we really need to talk about is, so what are the causes and effects, the impacts of climate change on the built and natural environments? That's global change when you put all of that together. So you'll hear me interchange climate change and global change, but there's a distinction, and I'll be talking about that as we go along. The third part of the talk will be some examples of the impacts of climate change and how it relates to green infrastructure and what I understand to be green infrastructure from my little myopic corner of the world. And this is where my revelation really came to be, is that when I started to put together examples of where the Department of the Interior, where the federal government is going and trying to deal with the impacts of climate change and global change, I started to piece together sort of a basic set of tenets about green infrastructure. And one of them that I came out of this, for me, was an enormous revelation, is that when I step back and stop looking at things as just a bunch of coordinated pieces and look at the whole, green infrastructure has a duality to it in regard to global change. Part of that duality is that it is very vulnerable to climate change and global change, to human disturbance. The other part of it is that green infrastructure is absolutely critical to the health and welfare of this country and this globe when we start talking about the combined effects of climate change as one stress on top of an already stressed system of global change. It is one of the most basic fundamental elements for the survival of this planet, in my opinion, from what I see just in putting the examples together. So my revelation and education on this was understanding much better the so what of what green infrastructure really is and what it means in that interrelationship to climate change and global change. So thanks for having me, Chris. This has been a real education for me. I appreciate it. So how do I do the slides? Oh, there's a clicker in front of me. Look at that. See, if I would just shut up and look. So let's start with climate change, what we know and how we know it. First, we know that it is unequivocal that human-induced climate change is taking us outside the range of our historical experiences. As a geologist, I know that there have been times in the geologic record, many millions of years ago in particular, where the rate and the actual conditions of climate change rival what we see today. But in terms of humankind's experience and time on this planet, that we are now outside the comfort range of what we've seen in the historic record. At the global and even the regional levels, the things that we see today have not been seen by man in the past on a large extent. Our understanding of climate change is informed by observations, monitoring, research, and modeling. If you think that what we're doing is just using a Ouija board and predicting the future, you're wrong. Our basic fundamental understanding of climate change comes from observations within the historical record and the geologic record. That is the foundation of the science that helps us to develop models that can use the past, understand the present, and look towards the future. Without that information and those observations, the models are nothing more than a Ouija board. With those observations, our models become a predictive tool with granted uncertainties, but something that gives us a look, a glimpse as to what the future will hold in terms of climate change, global change, and the future role of green infrastructure in helping to protect mankind. And then third, what the impacts of climate change are already occurring and are predicted to become more challenging in the future. It's unequivocal that if we continue on the trends that we're seeing now, be they man-made trends or natural trends, the truth of the matter is that the future will hold a different set of conditions than what we're seeing today. And I'll talk a little bit about what that will mean. So this slide here is, well, it's a cartoon, but it'll give you the feel, the so what message from this is everything is interrelated. You cannot look at any component of this world without thinking about its interdependencies to everything else. From the gray environment, the gray infrastructure, to the social infrastructure, to the green infrastructure, they're all interrelated. What we do in one impacts the other or another. And we need to start looking at things from what we call a systems-based approach. Too many times in the past, our scientific studies, our policies, our applications, and our engineering have been predicated on what's on the ground locally with a myopic view towards what's next door. We need to take a more holistic approach in how we deal with our science and how that science informs policy, and that's really the world that I live in. And the piece that I was really missing is I was looking myopically at the green infrastructure as bits and pieces, a tree, a forest, a wetland, and I wasn't integrating and interconnecting them to the bigger picture. This is something we need to do a better job of. In terms of the climate change, I'll go through this quickly. This is basically temperature readings from 1900 to 2000. That's what the temperature variation over that time looks like. Basically, the gist of this is that temperatures have been rising over the last 100 years across the globe. When you take a look at models that take the data on temperature change and try to replicate them through models using only what we call natural environmental parameters or forces, you get that blue, sorry, I'm colorblind, that's blue to me, it may be something else to you. That colored box there, that shaded envelope, are the model simulations of temperature from 1900 to 2000, and you can see that natural forces alone do not do a good job of replicating the observed past. When you take the natural forces and the human forces, including our emissions of CO2, nitrous oxide, methane, sulfur dioxide, ozone to the atmosphere, you can see that in that red box, again, red or pink, whatever it is to you, that we can actually do a pretty darn good job of replicating temperatures with our models that use those observations and forces to replicate the past. We can do this very well when we include both the natural and human forces. The moral of the story here is that you have to take into consideration the human impacts and human contributions to global warming and climate change in order to be able to understand not only the past, but model and predict the future. Natural forces alone do not explain what is going on with our climate system. And to be very clear to you, the physics of the climate system are very, very simple. Understanding how they will change physically from one point in time to another, from one location to another, is the complexity. So the basic takeaway message from this is that if you want to understand climate change, you have to understand all the forces, both the human-induced forces as well as the natural forces. And therefore, you have to understand processes that occur within the gray and social infrastructure as well as the green infrastructure. So indicators of humanity's fingerprints on climate are pretty coincidental and pretty straightforward as well. Is when you look at population change over the last thousand years, and then you start looking at CO2 emissions, nitrous oxide, methane emissions, and temperature, you can see the coincidence in the path. They are interrelated. The more people you put on the planet, the more stuff you put in the air. The more stuff we put in the air, the more we change the climate. And it just so happens that the things that we put into the atmosphere cause or trigger an increase in temperature across the globe. But that's just temperature. What we need to look at is, so what are the linkages of climate change to impacts and effects? And if you look at the box on the left, what we're seeing are rising temperatures, increasing heavy downpours, rising sea level, longer growing seasons. So keep in mind that how you place a value on these things depends upon what eyes you look at the problem through. Longer growing seasons to Scandinavian countries or some drought-prone countries may be a good thing, as are heavy downpours in some examples or some cases, not in all. Reductions in snow and ice, well, you can again put value on that, but these are the observations about what's happening. And changes in the amount and timing of river flows are things we're already observing. Our response to climate change is basically twofold. When we talk about mitigation in the climate world and in the climate policy world, that means reduction of greenhouse gases from the atmosphere in order to ameliorate the impacts of climate change. Adaptation is our response to present and future climatic conditions. A lot of people look at these as being isolated and two things. I look at them as one, especially from a science and policy perspective. If you want to reduce the risk and increase the success of any proposed adaptation to climate change, you're better off in doing so if you're mitigating at the same time. Your risk goes down as the mitigation goes up. Likewise, taking no action to mitigate greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere is a decision. It's a bad decision and a high-risk decision for adaptation. We can still adapt in some cases, but the likelihood of success goes down as the lack of mitigation goes up. So in order to try to deal with some of this, one of the things I've been working on through the Council on Environmental Quality at the White House is a Presidential Executive Order 13514, which is basically aimed at the adaptation and mitigation of climate change and the reduction of our carbon footprint within federal agencies. So there are two major components to this. One is dealing with greenhouse gases through reducing our carbon footprint. The other one is to try to come up with adaptation strategies that facilitate the quality of life of people on the planet, led through the federal actions and policies of the federal government. As part of this, we've also looked at a more green federal infrastructure as well, trying to develop a more green infrastructure that promotes more successful adaptation and possibly with the co-benefits of successfully reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. The bottom line message that we've learned in this process, and I was telling Chris about this before, was that when we first started, I think senior leadership in the federal government thought we were going to come in and develop a set of guiding principles and practices that would tell you what to do. And what we've learned in the process is that you folks on the ground are the ones who better understand what it is you need to do in order to promote a resilient, sustainable environment and society. If it's through the development of effective green infrastructure, the development of adaptation strategies, even the development of local mitigation strategies, it's those efforts at the local level that are showing the most action today. And our job at the federal level is now being moved more towards trying to enable and empower your decision-making, not make decisions for you, but to provide you with the information, especially the science, that can help guide better decisions by you. That involves a very intimate, iterative relationship with the stakeholders, all of you, with the federal government. And at the end of this talk, I'd like to just propose one instrument that you can use to help inform better decisions on your part. So let's go a little bit to the effects of climate change. I just wanted to give you some of the information from the most recent Global Change Research Program Impact Report or National Assessment. Again, this is a report that's put together by hundreds of scientists reaching a consensus on the conclusions, and this is for the United States. This is a little hard to see, but basically if you look at the left-hand side at the top, you're looking at observations of average change in temperature from 1993 to 2008. And what you see is that temperatures indeed did go up a little bit. But as you start to look at scenarios for the future, lower or higher emission scenarios are basically based on the amount of CO2 that we think we're going to put into the atmosphere over those periods of time. We have a low emission scenario and then what we call the high emission scenario back in this report when it was developed in 2009. And what you can see is that at the middle of the century, see if this works, we see that temperatures will increase and that you can see a significant increase in the higher emission scenario compared to the lower emission scenario. But by the end of the century, we're talking about significant regional temperature increases over the country, regardless of whether you look at the lower or a higher emission scenario. Again, low versus high is a relative term, but what I can tell you is based on information coming out of Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change reports today across the globe, this higher emission scenario is now becoming a middle of the road scenario. So we need to look at this in a whole new light in terms of the relative nature of what we mean by emissions. And the outcome, I'm not going to say is good or bad, it's just that we are going to be seeing significantly higher regional average temperatures over the course of the next 100 years, especially towards the end of this century. So what does that mean for impacts of climate change and green infrastructure? Well, in this case, I'm going to use a case from the Kenai Peninsula with pine bark beetle infestation. Basically, warmer average temperatures and longer growing seasons, less cold snaps, mean that the pine bark beetle actually will develop a third progeny of young during any given season. And that proliferation of beetles is causing a major impact to pine forests within the Pacific Northwest and as in the Rocky Mountains of the western states as far as southern Colorado. But here in the Kenai Peninsula, you can see that from 1972 to 1985, pine bark beetle distribution and proliferation was limited. It's extensive at this point. The point I wanted to make about the green infrastructure piece to this is that there's now reason to believe that these infestations of pine bark beetles may have the ability to jump species of trees and stands of conifers into the northern jack pine forests, which means that its eventual migration to the eastern United States could occur if that were to be the case. So what becomes a local Northwest problem now may be a more regional or national problem in the future. The reason the pine bark beetle is a problem, in case you don't know, is that it kills the trees and it's increasing both fire intensity and fire frequency, as well as the proliferation of invasive species and the inhibition of the development of wildlife corridors. So again, the green infrastructure piece to this is the forest, but the interrelationship with things like the health and vitality of species or communities of animals and plants, as well as water quantity and quality, are enormous. Number of days over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. You can see the observations and then the predictions in the high-end scenario and the low-end scenario, as I mentioned before. And as we start to talk about high temperature days, we also correlate that with fire frequency and fire intensity in places like the Great Basin of the West. Again, in part, a natural system with little impact locally from the social system or the gray system. But in fact, what we're looking at are places that are positive green infrastructure for both agricultural communities as well as wildlife communities and for people as well. The problem with the Great Basin that we're seeing is with increasing temperature and decreasing precip and the increase in fire intensity and frequency, that these areas are the natural vegetation and landscapes are being destroyed and proliferation of invasive species is occurring. Again, inhibiting things like wildlife corridors, successful agricultural usage of the lands, animal grazing, and so forth. But there are steps that are being taken by agencies like the Bureau of Land Management in order to try to ameliorate the effects through the development of new green infrastructure, including mapping of vulnerable soils and soil disturbance to figure out how we can foster what are called biological crusts, controlling fire as much as possible, and big programs at restoring native plant species, all of which are hoped will reduce the fire intensity frequency issue, even in the face of changing climate, and promote the successful return of the green infrastructure. Another example is rising sea level, and I have several examples of this. One is from Albemarle Peninsula in North Carolina that the Fish and Wildlife Service is championing. Again, we can go through the details, but to make it very quick, with current and future rates of sea level rise, significant inundation of the mid-Atlantic low elevation stand of the coast will be impacted, and we're looking at inundation of not only a lot of federal lands, but of our available green infrastructure that protects the built environment. So some of the steps that are now being taken, along with better science to better predict and project what kinds of rates and inundation patterns we'll see, include restoring wetland hydrology caused by artificial ditches. These ditches may have been in the past considered part of the green infrastructure. They're now considered a harm to the green infrastructure that protects the shoreline from future accelerated erosion. You can see some of the other steps that are being taken, including a very novel approach to oyster reef restoration on the banks of the barrier islands and the mainland that is used as a buffer to storm surge and sea level rise. Basically steps to induce a more healthy, robust, and resilient green environment that can protect the built environment from damage in the future due to sea level rise and storm surge. Other examples of where this is being developed include New Orleans, where a lot of the area of the Gulf Coast is below 4 feet in elevation above current sea level. I want to point your attention to this train of barrier islands, the Chandeleur Islands, which have historically protected the New Orleans low standing elevation area from storm surge. They serve as a shield or a protective barrier. These islands were significantly damaged during Hurricane Katrina. Left in a natural state, they are starting to replenish themselves, but because of the change of influx or outflux of sediments through the Mississippi River Delta system, their nourishment or renourishment is severely hampered. And what we're looking at is that when you look at barrier islands that are not really natural parts of the functioning system, but rather more built environments, they tend to have a point effect of exacerbating storm surge and the impacts of erosion related to sea level rise. So the gist of the matter here is that the green infrastructure, the barrier island systems here, when left to their natural ways of forming and developing, serve as a shield to storm surge and the inundation effects of sea level rise. When developed, they tend to become unstable and amplify the effects of sea level rise and storm surge in specific areas. So it's a real problem that science is trying to figure out how to deal with to replenish the green infrastructure while promoting the resilience of the built environment as well. Either way, those barrier islands are a key to the future welfare of areas like New Orleans. The same can be true said of the Florida Peninsula. You can see the areas in red that with 1 meter of sea level rise will be inundated. And as we look across the country at population changes in population from 1970 to 2008 on the eastern seaboard in the Gulf, you can see a significant amount of that population growth has been in these low-standing elevation areas. So again, if the green infrastructure is protecting the built infrastructure, as the population in these coastal areas increases, the need to protect and to restore and enhance the resilience of the green infrastructure is going to become even more critical. The other area that obviously stands out that I don't want to talk about in detail today is the arid, drought-prone area of the Southwest. Significant population centers and growth of those centers in this area where, again, protecting the green infrastructure means protecting groundwater and surface water recharge, the quality of water for not only human consumptive use, but for ecological services as well. So there are extreme co-benefits to protecting green infrastructure in all parts of the country related to things like water availability and water quality. The final example I want to give you is one of my favorites. This is a real gem of a study that's been done in the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta of California, part of the CalFed San Francisco Bay program. And it was done through the U.S. Geological Survey and the U.S. Forest Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, excuse me. And it involves, if you look at this one little island over here, this is called Twitchell Island. And basically, this area in here is an agricultural part of the low-standing delta. And what scientists have found is that continued rigorous agricultural practices in the delta are leading to a degradation of the quality of the soil and a lack of accretion of the plant life in these areas that ultimately leads to a drop down or a subsidence of the land and an amplification of sea level rise and storm surge in this area. Basically, the land is going down while the water is going up. So what the USGS and Fish and Wildlife Service did was to come into Twitchell Island and restore natural plants, reeds and wetland grasses, and found that there were some interesting results from that study. Number one, the accretion rate of the organic matter went up about 25-fold. So the actual rate of accretion led to an increase in the elevation of the land, which is outpacing both inundation and sea level rise. So basically what we're doing is developing a barrier, a levee system through the natural grasses to sea level rise and inundation. The other thing is that those grasses store a significant amount of carbon. They are carbon sinks, not carbon emitters. So it's a nice carbon example of biological carbon sequestration, which has positive impacts on the global climate system, which is a feedback process to sea level rise. So we're actually ameliorating the impacts of climate change and global warming while promoting the development of these barriers. In addition, those grasses serve as forage grounds for critical waterfowl and nursery and breeding grounds for critical fish that the Fish and Wildlife Service is invested with protecting. So there are significant co-benefits to green infrastructure development through studies like this. And this is one of my favorite applications we've been working on at the Department of the Interior. And that study, that pilot, is now looking at transferability to places like New Orleans and the greater Everglades ecosystem. So what I want to leave you with is that the education that I've had is that we need to look at green infrastructure in totality. And I hope the examples I've shown you of what we've been working on lead to two major conclusions. One, if cared for and strategically thought through, green infrastructure can serve as a very critical protector of the built environment and the protection and welfare of people while enhancing their quality of life. But the second point to this is that green infrastructure is also itself very vulnerable to the impacts of not just climate change, but global change, including urban sprawl and misuse of agricultural and land use practices. So the last thing I want to leave you with is I never like to leave a talk by just saying, that's what I learned on my summer vacation, see you later. I want to leave you with something that I think can serve as an instrument for you in your work and your role in developing green or promoting green infrastructure. And that is the program that I've just taken over at the White House, the U.S. Global Change Research Program. It's a 13 federal agency program with a $2.6 billion annual budget. It's the largest climate change, global change research program in the world. And that program has been charged through the Global Change Research Act with understanding, assessing, predicting, and responding to human-induced and natural processes of global change, including the things I've talked about in this talk. And you can see our vision and our mission are to educate and to promote and enable and empower the decision-making and the practices that are taken by all the citizens of this country. So what I want to reach out to you with today is that there are tools and mechanisms, even within the federal government, that are there for you. We're running the new National Climate Assessment, which is due out in 2013. We are holding over 50 stakeholder listening sessions across the country. I encourage you to go to the Global Change Research Program website, look at the schedule of events for that, and become involved in our stakeholder meetings. Because the stakeholder meetings are not just about listening, it's about engaging you and acting upon the kinds of information you need so that we better enable and empower your decision making and inform you from what we know through our enterprise. So with that, I'll stop. I don't know how long I've gone, but hopefully not too long. Again, I want to thank you for this opportunity. This has been a real learning experience for me. Thank you.
And we are going to take some questions for Tom before we then transfer to the general. So are there questions for Tom? And I figured there would be hands.
Hi, Kathy Buckley, Boston Metropolitan Planning Organization. Thank you. Between the mitigation and the carbon sequestration, which reminded me of the work of Alan Savory. I don't know if you've looked at his work or not.
A little bit.
If we really go nuts in both directions, and I know that carbon dioxide has a life of about 100 years. But if we really go crazy, is it possible to actually slow things down?
There are two pieces to mitigation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. One is to, realistically speaking, the first action that the Kerry-Lieberman bill, the Waxman-Markey bill tried to address was how can we slow down the rate and the amount of our emissions to the atmosphere. That's step number one. What can we do from this point forward? The second part to that is, are there technologies available to us that we can employ that can actually help to physically reduce the amount of CO2 and other greenhouse gases from the atmosphere? The answer to that is yes. The ability to implement that through policy actions at the federal level is, as you know, is a huge challenge. But the answer to that is it's not crazy. It's something that technologically is feasible to begin doing. But really, the first thing it starts with is slowing down the rate of emissions and therefore the amount of emissions that we're currently sending into the atmosphere. I want to point out that one of the things that the science definitely tells us is that indeed the thing called the climate commitment is real. And that is basically the inertia of the climate system for moving towards a more warmer environment today because of what we've already done with regard to the climate system. It's like a freight train. You can slow it down, but it's going to continue to move. And the most current scientific studies that I'm familiar with that are coming out today are telling us that even if we were to cut down all of our greenhouse gas emissions to zero today, it would still take well over 100 years before we would see a decrease in global temperatures. So what we're looking at already is a train moving down the tracks to a warmer environment. That's inevitable. That scientifically, that is just the reality of the situation. But the truth of the matter is that is not an excuse for not trying to mitigate greenhouse gases today and tomorrow, because what we do today will have impact as to what the magnitude of greenhouse gas concentrations and therefore temperatures will be for tomorrow. So some people think it's a hopeless proposition. I think you have to take it in steps, and it starts at the local level and moves up from there. Everything we do has some sort of impact. So it's not a crazy thing. It's complicated. It's at least a twofold process, the mitigation part, and it's going to take time. But it's an investment into the future at the very least. Can I say one more thing? Since you're from Boston Metropolitan, one of the examples I didn't show that's my second favorite is the Deer Island waste treatment facility, which is another great example of trying to harness the strength of the green infrastructure to promote resilience and sustainability of the built environment. So thank you for Deer Island. It's a great example.
Greg Slater with Maryland State Highway Administration. In Maryland, we have a very comprehensive mitigation side climate change program, and we're working very hard on the adaptation side right now. And in an organization where we are trying to look at things and build structures that are lasting 75 to 100 years, we're taking it very seriously. And what we're doing now is working and developing policy for adaptation in terms of not only what to adapt to, but when to adapt. Depending on the structure life and the life of the asset that we're looking at. Is there a particular climate model that your office has said this is the one we're going to focus on, or is it just a combination or a variation of these models?
Craig, that's a really good point. I'm glad you raised that. In case people aren't familiar with the climate models, the global climate models or general circulation models called GCMs, there's more than one that we use. And you have to start at the global level, even when you're trying to understand, especially when you're trying to understand climate at the very local level, which frankly we can't do at this point. You have to understand the global forces and the global interactions to step down effectively. There are 21 different global general circulation or global climate models across the world that are used. There is a model intercomparison process called CMIP that takes multiple models into account. All the models are based on the same general physics that I explained before. The physics are simple, but the parameters that affect the physics, the things that come in and out of the system, are the things that we really don't understand very well. And I'll give you one example, clouds. Clouds have an effect of rebounding radiation back out of the atmosphere that's coming in as solar radiation. But they also cool the surface of the Earth and at the same time trap heat in a greenhouse effect manner as well. So clouds are very hard to understand, and they're very hard to model at the local level. What we try to do is incorporate as many of the models as possible into our predictive assessments, because there's strength in the model into comparisons and the averaging of the models, because each of them brings different strengths and weaknesses together. We don't just take them all and average them. What we try to do is intercompare the models one by one and then one against all the others in order to figure out where the weaknesses are, remove those weaknesses, and enhance the strengths. And the different modeling communities, be it Hadley in England or the GFDL model at Princeton or a model in Japan, those communities interact very intimately and try to figure out from lessons learned on other models how they can make their models better. But when you see me use an envelope of conditions, the reason I use an envelope is not just because of the uncertainty of one model, it's because we're looking at all the models that are available and that we are amenable to whatever we're looking at. So the long answer to your short and very important question is we try to use multiple models and develop an ensemble of runs rather than just stick with one model. But I can talk to you more about that offline. That's a great question.
Yes, I'm Howard Aylesworth. I'm with Friends of Herring Run Parks in Baltimore, Maryland, so to keep up the Maryland thrust here. Yesterday there was a very interesting proposal that was put forward last night about having windmills out 10 miles out on the shore and so forth. We've had the BP oil spill and so forth, and the biggest issue for me is the question of how we incorporate the ocean systems and the land systems. What we've talked about today and yesterday and the day before are the land systems, but there's really a lack of emphasis. And I know that in the IPCC that the ocean models are not as sophisticated as the ones that deal with the atmosphere and so forth. So is it going to be a priority at some time to start addressing this issue of the oceans and the sea and the effect and mitigation measures and so forth?
Well, another good question. I would actually beg to differ with what you said, more not to the point of what you came to, but rather how you got there. There actually are a fair number of fairly robust ocean circulation models and ocean health coupled ecological models with those. But a lot of the runs were not available for IPCC AR4, the fourth assessment report. I think I'm affiliated with IPCC. I'm not one of the scientists co-authoring reports, but I oversee the science that's done and the scientists who participate. And one of the things that you will see in AR5 is greater emphasis not only on ocean health, but the three-dimensional ocean circulation. And there is one particular model that's being developed through the U.S. Geological Survey, Duke University, and NASA that looks at the past geologic record where there have been similar conditions in what's called the Pliocene period to what we're seeing today, and uses that information, the paleo information, to better develop the boundary conditions for 3D ocean circulation across the globe. And those results will be included, are supposed to be included in AR5, the fifth assessment report. But going back to your end point of the question is, yes, there needs to be greater emphasis on the oceans because the oceans are the lifeblood of the climate system. And for as much as I showed observations that show significant change in the terrestrial environment related to climate change, there are significant potential changes occurring today in the ocean, including the achievement of thresholds like the capacity of the oceans to buffer CO2 and temperature that we are just starting to get a hold of today. And issues like, will the Gulf current stop? Will the conveyor belt shut down? What's the likelihood of that? What will be the impacts? And how does that link to the GCMs for the terrestrial environment? Those kinds of questions I think will be better addressed in AR5.
Walter Sedovic, I'm a restoration architect in the lower Hudson Valley, New York metropolitan area. As architects, we concern ourselves with the interrelationship of gray infrastructure and green infrastructure. How does your work instruct you on the relative efficacy of hard systems, gray infrastructure systems relative to green infrastructure systems in either mitigation or adaptation, and not only in our country but worldwide?
I think I'll have a hard time addressing that because I think defining the efficacy part of that is a little bit difficult. Let me give you an example of what I mean. The Department of the Interior manages 1 out of every 5 acres of this country. And we have trust resource mission mandates across 8 bureaus. 1 is a science wing, the USGS. The other 7 are resource management bureaus that are trusted with managing our energy resources in the terrestrial environment as well as offshore, all the way to cultural and historical resources, protecting indigenous people to threatened and endangered species. We have a mandate to ensure that the gray environment is sustainable and resilient because we have protection of lands where that gray environment exists through transmission lines, oil and gas lines, so on and so forth, but also the green infrastructure as well. I have to be honest that I don't think we've done a very good job at integrating the 2 different pieces together, which is required in order to really address your question, but rather we've treated them separately through independent organic mission mandates to those bureaus. So at times, to be honest, the organic mission mandate of the Fish and Wildlife Service is even at odds with the organic mission mandate of the National Park Service. They have different missions and they have conflicting agendas at times. I think what we are realizing, and Secretary Salazar at DOI has picked up on this, is that we need to start integrating our strategic implementation of energy resources, including hydroelectric, wind, solar, geothermal, with the more traditional fossil fuel energy resources, and climate change, as an example. So we're in the process now, or I should say Secretary Salazar and his team, I'm sort of stepping away from that for the time being, are trying to bring the different groups together to sit down together to see if there are co-benefits to strategic planning for both the gray and the green infrastructure. But I really can't be the one to sit here and say that I can assess the efficacy of one piece or the other, or either in totality. There are extreme demands on both. There are conflicting interests with both at times, but I think there are great complementary opportunities that are just starting to be realized. So I'd like to talk more with you about that.
That was excellent, Tom. We could have questions, I think, all morning for you. Are
And
you
you
going to
can
be?
see I won't shut up if you do. So,
Well,
and I know the general would like a chance to get at
Of course,
it.
it's not what I was going to say, Tom, but we really appreciate you coming, and we want to give you a big round of applause.
Thank you.